Are we still sisters?
Nothing is ever going to change that.
I always knew you'd come back.
What's going on?
Make her go away. Please.
Okay, I want to start this with a real, true fact about Arcane that should be incredibly encouraging to all writers. There's a giant misconception that whenever you start learning anything, you're basically starting at the bottom of a mountain. And you've got this long, long journey ahead of you. You are a white belt, and the way it works is that maybe after years and years of hard work and confusion and suffering, you'll progress through all the other belts and maybe finally earn your black belt. And the thing that's crazy about Arcane is that these guys had never written a story before. Of course, they had experience with other types of media, but Arcane was the first full narrative that Christian, Linke, and Alex E. had ever worked on. In terms of storytelling itself, they were beginners, just like me, just like you, and they went from white belt straight to black belt. They just got to the mountain and teleported right to the top. And it goes to show that as much as experience is undoubtedly important, it is still possible to get there just by making really, really smart decisions. It is possible for the first story you ever write to be on the level of something like Arcane. So not to get your hopes up, this doesn't make it any less hard, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that it is possible. So let's look into this. Let's see what some of these super duper smart decisions were. This is going to be a video of writing tips and lessons and tools as usual, but I am only using quotations from these three people. Christian, Linke, and Alex E., the two creators and head writers of Arcane, and Amanda Overton, another main writer they hired. And I say I'm only using quotations, that's not entirely true, because my goal is to mine these gems of writing wisdom for every last drop of value I can get out of them. So it's going to be quotes plus my own extrapolations, deductions, inductions, etc. Gonna play a quote, talk about it, play a quote, talk about it. That's gonna be the plan here. Here are the major topics if you want to skip around, and I'll leave timestamps for the individual lessons themselves. Alright, so first I'm gonna start with what I think is the most important piece of advice. If you're looking to hear the Arcane creators explain one storytelling element that sums up the writing in the show, listen to this comment from Christian Linke in the AMA. Good story, in my mind, is all about hard choices. I think Alex and I gravitate towards stories that leave characters with costly or even impossible choices. And Amanda Overton said in the same AMA, answering the question of how they wrote the finale to encapsulate so much emotion and meaning, she said, I think of this in terms of what a character hopes and fears. You have to know what these are and make sure the audience knows too, and use them to tug a character towards impossible decisions. So that is lesson number one. Give your characters impossible decisions. Kind of the basic piece of advice that you'll often hear is give your characters a goal, something they want more than anything else, and then conflict comes from throwing obstacles in the way of that. And that can work, but what the Arcane writers are saying is to take the next step here. Give your characters impossible decisions, meaning give your characters two things they want more than anything else, or give them two sets of consequences that they fear more than anything else, and have the narrative guide them to a crossroads where they must choose between those two things. Am I Powder or am I Jinx? Do I choose to be alone or do I choose my enemy? Do I choose my daughter or my city? Or alternatively, do I choose my daughter or my city? And you can make it way more complex as well. Vi isn't just choosing between her sister and her girlfriend, she's choosing whether or not to give up on her sister. She's choosing whether or not to accept that her sister is gone forever. Mel isn't just deciding whether to support Jace or not, she's deciding between two parts of her own identity. The ruthless Medarda as defined and trained by her mother, or the merciful little girl who valued peace. And you can go through every main character and you can see how they all got these two-pronged decisions that pitted themselves against themselves. Two things I want, or two sets of things that I don't want, two sets of dire consequences. And this is a huge part of what makes Arcane so character-driven. That its climaxes don't just come down to moments that mean something for the character. No, instead we get moments where characters are really defining who they are by their decisions. And on that note, Christian said about Silco, at the end of the season he realizes far too late what it's like to have something to lose. Just like Vander, radical notions begin to stumble when your loved ones are threatened by your ideology. So our second lesson here, find complexity in the character's relationship to change. Development and change is something which is necessary for great characters, but it doesn't need to stop there. Characters don't need to realize that they've changed. They can resist it, they can be ignorant of it, they can realize but too late. They can oppose the change they see in other characters, or they can deny that change or fight others over that change, and that too can be a rich source of conflict. And to just combine these first two lessons, we now have such a perfect model of how to set up these impossible decisions that results in a complex relationship to change. What we see with Vi, with Vander, with Silco, with Mel, with Heimerdinger, is that the character starts out with one goal and they fight so hard for that goal that they become a different person. And that person secretly develops another goal that the character isn't even aware of. until it's threatened. And then they have to choose between it and their first goal, and we see other characters becoming hostile to that deviation. It's a great template. Another beautiful stated version of this impossible choice phenomenon to use as a template, listen to this quote.
Well, for Vi and for Jinx, the central question is, can you ever forgive a monster? How far are you willing to go for your sibling? Is there a line where you just can't go for your sibling and you just have to say, sorry, but this is where I have to leave you?
He was talking specifically about the sisters relationship, but it's terrific advice in general to ask this question. What is the line your character won't cross? Or even more broadly, what is a line that some people will not cross? You can build a character around that. You can build an arc around that. You can build a cast of characters with a variety of arcs around that. And what that looks like is not the big goal with the obstacles thrown in the way. It's a plot that pushes characters further and further to that line, and we have the characters trying to find ways not to cross that line, and circumstances will stop those efforts, and other characters will also try to stop those efforts, but inevitably they are brought right to that line. They cannot stop themselves from having to face that decision, and then we just get to see what happens, see what the character decides. And on the same note, on the topic of how to frame these uncrossable lines, these decisions, Christian said, characters like Jinx and Silco constantly murder and manipulate. Can an audience still root for them? It's a bit of a dance between their many risky actions and choices. The finale of episode 3 was scary because both Vi and Powder really mess up and make terrible decisions. At the same time, we didn't want these choices to alienate them entirely. And Amanda added, a character making terrible decisions is so much more forgivable if you too have felt what they're feeling. I always say I love characters that do the right thing for the wrong reasons or the wrong thing for the right reasons. Everything else is boring. So lesson 4, use empathy to prevent characters' flaws and mistakes from alienating your audience. I'm sure you've all had the experience of watching a horror movie and screaming at the screen, "Don't go in there, you idiot!" And writers excuse this by saying, no, it's good for characters to be flawed and to make mistakes. But when characters are just making mistakes to drive the plot forward, that's when you alienate them from the audience, meaning it undermines why the audience connected in the first place. Horror movie characters are the audience stand-ins. We identify with them. They are us experiencing the story through their eyes, but once they make decisions we wouldn't make, that's it, I cannot connect anymore.
And there's something in Latin.
Okay, do not read the Latin.
Read it.
What the
Read it out loud. Dolor.
No. Stop.
Arcane's characters make so many mistakes, but we're always on board because it never contradicts the reason we connect. On the contrary, it's always in line with, it's caused by the reason we connect. These mistakes are often the most relatable things about the characters. And even when they're not, even when we disagree and we would never do that, there's still always something there that makes us go, I totally get the underlying emotion, even if I wouldn't make that particular decision. Continuing on the topic of character templates to build your characters around, here are two that are kind of connected. During the early phases of development, we always talked about everyone's chip on their shoulder. Silco's was being the dirty little thing, never being enough, always having topside look down on him. He could never quite get past it, and even if it would take his life to escape that existence, so be it. He had nothing to lose. And Amanda said Jinx and Powder before her was always desperate to prove herself worthy. Worthy of her sister's faith in her, worthy of Silco's faith in her. We shouldn't have to prove ourselves worthy of love, but that is a struggle we all face in so many different ways. So these are two more qualities to build a character around. Give them a chip on their shoulder, or give them something to prove. To dig into these a little bit, the first one, a chip on your shoulder, it's an interesting idiom. The official definition is a deeply ingrained grievance or feeling of resentment, often deriving from a sense of inferiority and marked by aggressive behavior. And you can see it's kind of the flip side of our second category here. I think the main difference being that something to prove doesn't necessarily have the resentment either yet or at all, and doesn't have as overt of a sense of inferiority. Probably has some of that under the surface, but not necessarily. I think you can look at Jace and you can see a primary example of that. So whichever aspect you want to focus on, the positive or the negative, give your character this kind of motivator. I want to prove that I am worthy of love. I want to prove that there's science to magic. I want to prove I'm not just the family outcast, or that I'm not just a dirty little nobody from the undercity who will never impact this world. I think it's such an effective template because it tells you exactly what this character needs to do. It guides individual interactions, and also tells you what aspect of your central conflict to use to kind of rope this character into the main conflict. Don't just make war between Piltover and Zahn and have the characters reacting to that. Shape that conflict in a way that hurts Mel's dignity. Shape it in a way that makes Silco feel weak. Shape it in a way that makes Jinx feel unloved. Okay, so still on the topic of character creation, I just want to go through a bunch of the starting points that the Arcane writers talk about using, because there really are a lot and they're all good. Listen to Christian talking about Jinx.
It sprung from a question that we just as audience members and players had, like there's things that are pretty easy to declare on the surface level, right? She's a loud, chaotic, dangerous character. She's a weapons tinkerer. She is kind of, larger than life personality. But when it gets to like the why is she the way, she is, like that's where we ended up with some pretty different theories and I think that's just felt like people want to answer that, like was she the same when she was younger? Was she very different? Was she shy? Was she really out to kind of prove her own worth and that kind of stuff? What was the thing that happened that really broke, Little Powder into pieces and let her kind of grow into Jinx?
So once you're acquainted with their character, their personalities, their goals, etc., ask questions about their life. Why are they like this? Were they always like this? What changed them? What were their childhood goals? These are all great, and also just more generally, just find the most interesting questions to ask about your characters. Construct your story in a way that asks those questions and then answers them in meaningful ways. Here's a major example of this that Alex explains, and I think this is a really interesting idea.
It's really kind of a blessing, I guess, when you can start out with sort of a built-in question. Like Vi was introduced first and Jinx comes later, and Jinx is this enemy of Vi's, and she's got, this axe to grind, with Vi, but you really don't have a lot of idea why. Like when she joined the league, we had a lot of like, I guess, promotional efforts which were sort of like this mysterious character is coming at out of nowhere and really just sort of sabotaging or feels like she's gunning for Vi. Like one of the things that I thought was really creative for the web team was that they took Vi's biography page, or the one that shows her abilities both, actually, and sort of like had the sort of spray paint graffiti over it that suddenly appeared when Jinx was coming out. And so but we never told anyone exactly what it was that went down between the two of them. And I think there was this big question from the beginning, like, are they sisters? Are they related? And what went on? And so, like Christian said, that was the question to unpack.
Start with a really strong emotion, strong enough that the audience becomes curious about it. Or alternatively, start with a really defined relationship, and then find the interesting story that leads us there. Alex continues.
We really asked ourselves in the beginning was, like, people know these characters as champions when they're grown up, but like, will it matter? Will it resonate to them? The fact that they've been separated, if we can't understand, the reason, that Jinx would, like, what emotional background would make it that Jinx can be so fixated and so obsessed with Vi. And so, ultimately we decided, that, like, in order for them being sisters to matter at all, we have to see where it began, and we have to see why that relationship is so significant and made such an impression on Jinx. And so, that really, really was the focus in the very beginning, was saying, like, we need them to be as close as possible. We need this relationship to matter as much as possible, in order to, I guess, justify the desire to see them, or rather the pain of seeing them split apart and the desire to see them come back.
For this strong emotion to be meaningful, where do we need to start? What progression gets us there? What are all the steps? What do we feel at each juncture? What scenes can we build around those steps and those feelings? This is my favorite type of brainstorming, because it's not just starting with standalone independent ideas. I think the best ideas at this stage are ideas that generate other ideas. Once we have something like hatred, that tells a whole story and tells us a structure for that story. Next, very similar, listen to this Christian clip.
There's definitely something about an authentic feeling of what it feels like to be Vi or Jinx, in the game. I mean, if you play Vi in League of Legends, you know that if there's a fight, you go in first, and you probably don't make it out alive. And so you don't know that when you just look up a page about the character. You just kind of have to play her to know that based on her, like, gameplay kit, on her abilities and that kind of stuff. And so it's definitely something that I think we want to respect, because, this is how this feels also authentic to our audience.
And by the way, it is worth admitting that Arcane was starting ahead of most of us with all these character creation things, because they had this set of characters who are already fleshed out in a different medium. But honestly, I don't really think that matters too much. Even without all that, with new characters you've just made, ask, how does it feel to be this character? Or what is the moment-to-moment experience of this character? And pay attention to how he talks about the feeling. He doesn't just say exciting or fearless. He's looking for descriptions of feelings that translate to behavior. Okay, moving on a similar note.
They're always in this one map, in this one environment. And you start to wonder, like, where do they sleep? What do they eat? What is their normal life like? You know, like what kind of families would they have?
So you've got your crazy, dangerous Doom Girl character, and what is she doing all day? Well, she's going to be at her workbench. She's going to be cranking up the rock and roll, making explosives. She's going to be doing experiments that fail in explosive fashion. She's going to be antagonizing henchmen who are on her own side. She'll be hosting macabre tea parties with mannequins of dead family members. And also just, freaking out a lot, having paranoid arguments with herself, talking to her hallucinations, throwing tantrums, missing her sister. The reason why I think this step is so important, whether you consciously stop to think about it or just let it flow, is that there's such a great distance between like the character profile info and what you actually write. I can have all that stuff figured out, the central conflict, the central goals, the core personality traits, the backstory, the flaws, the strengths. How do we go from that to a scene? It's all these little details about who a character is that will populate your scenes. This is the stuff that's going to give you material to use in translating that structure into words on a page. Okay, next, on a similar note here.
I think one of the things that they did really early on that helped us quite a bit with working on story and sort of developing these characters was we had pretty much from the outset of the writer's room these sort of individual themes for all of the different characters, and those themes had basically they were like 2 or 3 minutes, and they had their own sort of journey, right? Sort of tracking the arc of the character, and it's really stunning how when someone manages to capture that essence in music, right, and with the right instruments, how it it infuses you, I guess, as you're sort of working. It was I think many of the writers would. It's like what you listen to in your headphones, right, as you're staring at a blank page, wondering why you ever committed to this profession.
This is a well-known Tarantinoism, so I've heard. He apparently starts with the soundtrack. He finds very early on the music that will characterize his scenes, his big moments, his characters, music that puts him into the mood, the mindset of these people so he can write them better. I think what this is about is that there's always this undefinable aspect to who a character is. It's a feeling that you can't capture on like the profile sheet. But just because it's undefinable, that doesn't mean it's worth ignoring. Find media that expresses that quality and use that to guide you. And this can be something like music, but it can also be like an aesthetic, it could be fashion, it could be clips of other media, it could be a color palette, whatever it is, find it, use it. Okay, next, also in a similar vein, listen to this Amanda clip.
You're like always trying to get into the heads of your characters in any way you can. I did have one of the writers teach me how to shoot a gun, like a sniper gun, right before I was gonna write Caitlin's episode last year. I would prefer not to have a punching bag in my living room, but that's just what we do right now, so. I actually never thought about how my kung fu translates to learning how Vi's a fighter.
This is partially again about getting to that mode, that mindset, but it's also about more than that. Do things your characters do. Live a day in their life and see how you feel. See what you think about when you're doing the things they do. Actively trying out something like sparring or shooting a gun is going to give you all these little details and emotions that fill out the picture you're painting and make things feel authentic. Or it could even do way more than that. It could change the way you think about the character entirely. It could change the whole feel to a character. It could even change where their story goes. Okay, this next quote is from a different mental move, but it's still in the same general ballpark. Alex said in the AMA, "For me, the best moments come from characters when they surprise you. It's easy to feel omnipotent or omniscient when you're a storyteller. You're usually one step ahead. But sometimes, as you brainstorm all the ways a character might handle a situation or argue a point, they say or do something you hadn't considered. In the best instances, it knocks you off kilter as much as their opponent in the scene/story. I guess this is all to say, strive to make your characters cleverer than you. So basically, forget where you want a story or scene to go, what the characters need to do, and adopt a mindset of letting your characters write their own story. Let them tell you how a scene is going to play out. Let them write their own character profile sheet. Let them fill in their own little details." Okay, next. This one is a bit of a Season 2 spoiler if you're not a League player and don't know the lore of specific champions. I'm going to mute the name and description here, that's kind of spoilery, but I have it subtitled on screen if you do want to know who Christian is talking about.
I remember when we put out, for example, certain stories were released, how there was kind of an outcry, and like what kind of nuance there is among the perception of our audience. So I think a lot of it was just really trying to get a good idea of like what is it that makes these characters special in the eyes of our audience, and trying to respect that, and then finding, I think, what we have to say with the story that we're going to craft. But
so this is just a fantastic question to ask. Where is the nuance? So let's say you got your manic pixie girl. Where is the nuance here? What makes them feel like a real person? Is it something about their past? Is it something about their relationship? Something about what they suffer from or how they suffer? And this other question he's asking is also what gets you to the nuance? Fine, this is an archetype we know, we're familiar with it, but what do we have to say about it? The action girl. We want to tell a story about how this character struggles when she's confronted by problems she can't hit. We want to tell a story about how this character is susceptible to avoidance. We want to tell a story about the sexuality and romantic life of a character like this. Okay, now coming at this from a totally different direction from the adaptation angle, listen to this fascinating way Alex describes the situation that he and Christian were in at the start of all this.
The characters that you see in the game are like the most embellished version of themselves. You have the sense of who these people are in their most extreme moments and in the most dire situations, and of course in combat. And so really the work for us was, honoring those highs, but then finding the lows.
Find the lows that respect the highs, or more generally, find the other side of your character. And again, I think this applies way beyond just the situation of adapting a video game. The beginning of characters generally so often is built from these highs that he's talking about, the idealized mode. You come up with an adventure character, a daring rogue, an ambitious dreamer, whatever it is, or you begin with some idealized low, whether it's mood-wise, a brooding character beset by all these woes and traumas, or low activity-wise. You have a slice of life, hangout vibe story, and you've come up with these slice of life hangout vibe characters, and you know what they're like in the calm parts of your story. But when things get more serious and higher stakes, at that point you don't know how to write them anymore. You don't know who they are in that mode. And chances are you're going to need to develop that so your characters feel like real human beings, and so that their arcs feel like real human stories. Now, Alex is not addressing here how to find that other side of the coin for characters. Sounds like there's a lot of options that they were considering, and that is a process I would absolutely love to hear them talk about. But once you do figure out, here's what he says is important.
Jinx in particular, her mania, her wildness, was so much the signature of her in the game, and certainly something that you feel like is the aspect of Jinx that players appeal to. Finding that quiet human side, right, the thoughtful side, the emotional side, in so many ways you're always asking yourself, are players going to look at this and be like, Jinx wouldn't do that, Jinx would just say something wild and blow something up? But I think it really isn't just sort of like playing with that balance and finding a way to make it feel like the transitions between those two states are authentic and believable.
I love the way he puts that. Even if you're not sure whether the thing you found is the absolute best fit ever, what can make it feel right and feel like it fits is the transition between the lows and highs. If the transition is justified, if that feels organic and realistic, then there's a good chance we'll just accept the whole bundle. When you look at the lows they did find for Jinx, for Powder, with her feelings of isolation, the bullying, the trauma, and obviously her extreme attachment to Vi, and similarly when you look at the lows they found for Vi, the way she looks up to Vander, her sense of loyalty, her love for her siblings, the leadership position she has with them, her playfulness, her romantic side, it's also easy to see how one side translates directly into the other. The justifications are just so well developed here. Okay, and the all-encompassing meta lesson from all these character creation methods is that the Arcane writers used all of them. And this applies equally to other aspects of the story. Listen to this.
I'm pretty sure we explored every format and way to write a Bible and season tracking document. I would be surprised if we had less than 20 or 30.
So use all your tools. Don't just pick one and use that and try to get everything you can out of it. The Arcane writers picked everyone. They picked 30. They did everything they could to develop these characters, everything they could to develop the arcs, the plot, everything. Any little thing that could possibly help, any possible new angle, whatever they need to do, they did that. And I'm not saying you need to use each one. I'm saying just definitely don't be shy about how many tools you're using from your toolbox. It is your toolbox. The tools are meant to be used, all of them. You make your tools happier when you use them, so use them all if you need to, if it's helpful. Okay, let's switch gears here and talk about plot. And Arcane is so character-driven that a lot of what we already said about character is about developing plot, especially the impossible decision stuff, the line you won't cross, etc. And I think in light of that especially, it's pretty bizarre to hear Alex talk about early drafts like this.
I think the biggest change from the way that we were looking at it before was it was very plot heavy, right? It's very focused on kind of like, what's the problem that has to get solved? Who's going to fight who?
So what does it mean for something to be plot heavy? I think there's a pretty common problem with beginner writers and experienced writers. I think there's just a thing that happens with writing that you plan out a story that's really interesting. We got intrigue and fight scenes and mysteries. We're building this series of events that's going to lead us to some big thing. But in the end, when you look back at it, it feels like that's all it is, just a series of events. Like Alex said, it's just introducing problems and then the problems being solved. The way I've heard other people put this is like the story story has no soul. Now, does every story need a soul? No, I don't think so. We here at Schnee headquarters work on the full cup model of storytelling. You can fill your cup with lots of different things. You can put in more character and less plot, more plot and less character, big themes and world building, and then pretty basic plot and character. One super fun character and pretty standard fun adventure story. Don't try to overstuff your cup, don't fill it with anything rotten, but more or less, if the cup is full, you've got a good story. A series of events that's really compelling on its own may not need anything else. And with this early plot-heavy draft of Arcane Season 1, it's hard to know exactly what was lacking, but from the way this episode of Beyond the Rift is talking about this, we can speculate it sounds like what happened is that they had events that were in line with character motivations on paper, but it wasn't coming across in the story. It felt like, here's the character, look at the character and the personalities, okay, now here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the problem, here's the solution. Here's event number 1, okay, now we're moving to event number 2, and that's going to bring us to event number 3, but it was all separated from that initial character focus. And then it seems like having people like Amanda on board helped write the character back into the story. It gave voice to the character conflicts and needs and wants underlying the general plot points, bringing that to the forefront through writing good dialogue like this line.
Amanda just has a really honest voice in her dialogue that is just really grounded emotionally. I remember this moment when Alex and I were really wrestling with the last words that Jinx was saying to Vi in season 1. And then like Amanda took the script and solved it in like, I don't know, an hour.
I thought maybe you could love me like you used to. Even though I'm different. But you changed too. So, here's to the new us.
Amanda just wrote that, and Alex and I were just like, yep, that's it.
And also arranging the moving parts of scenes so that more character elements were brought to the forefront in those scenes. Kind of like the little touch Amanda is talking about here.
Yes, I would love to bring Vi back into Caitlin's mind in this episode in some way. I wrote like something about missing Vi.
And also arranging the scenes themselves, arranging the moving parts of the entire season in a way that focused the character power at the heart of the narrative.
I'm quite proud of the cold open too, the like whole beginning of the season with the bridge. The cold open used to be the cold open from episode 3 when Silco was drowning. I sort of went out on a limb being like, so guys, I know you hired me to help out with the show and whatever, but you need to change the pilot. That's a lovely poetic image, right? But it wasn't telling the story of the series, which is these two sisters being torn apart.
So that's the concrete advice here. If your story feels soulless, like a dry series of events, breathe life into it by bringing character elements to the forefront every step of the way. This point that Christian talks about in the AMA and in lots of interviews is another huge part of this process. Many writers talk about being character-driven without actually writing character-driven stories. If you ask your hero whether or not they will help save the world from an alien invasion, the answer is always yes, duh. Thus, the character doesn't really have a decision to make. The sole question that remains is how are they going to overcome their obstacle, which is entertaining but doesn't drive the story forward with full autonomy. So I think this is another huge thing that addresses soullessness. Create a chain of events where it's only character choice that drives the story forward. This term, full autonomy, that means arranging the series of events so that they're not automatic. They're not based on circumstance. Use stakes and consequences and personal conflicts to make it so that characters repeatedly find themselves standing at actual moments of agency where the story could realistically go the other way, and the decision of what to do is left entirely to the character. And let me just say, I would absolutely give my left eyeball and a kidney and a lung to get my hands in early drafts of Arcane Season 1. I would so love to see that. Without that, a lot of this is just speculation on what the problem was and how they fixed it, but from what we have, I think this is a pretty reasonable picture to paint. To kind of concretize Christian's last point even more, listen to what he says here in the AMA. We didn't use one system to map the character arcs, but rather focus on them individually, and then mapped them against the world plot. In other words, we considered the world around the characters as its own entity with an arc, except that it only moved forward based on character choices. That way it feels like stakes are higher, and it truly feels like their actions have consequences that put the entire city at risk. That is a really, really interesting system. Again, I think this is a way of putting that last tip into practice, but what this emphasizes is how to make the story feel like it has weight. It's not just a bunch of people squabbling and having heart-to-hearts and occasionally punching each other. No, everything that happens matters. I see clear cause and effect at every step of the story. I think this formulation also helps you bring the setting to life. It's not just where where things take place, it's dynamic in all these ways it pushes and pulls as a result of character action. On a similar note, still on this topic of soullessness, here's another Christian quote from the AMA. Crafting the episodes and scenes in a fashion that builds the right tension over time and tracks all the parallel stories wasn't clicking yet at the time, so Alex and I getting help from the outside and learning more about how to break an episode really unlocked the episodes to be stronger. So just to focus on the first part of this quote, I think it's worth pointing out that he talks about not just tracking the character arcs, not just tracking the series of events, what happens next and what happens after that, etc. He's saying it's important to track the buildup of tension throughout your story. Track that aspect of the audience experience as its own thing, because you can have a series of events that have a clear chain of causality and progression, and still somehow it feels like there's just no tension at all. So what do you actually do? How do you make sure there is tension? What is this feeling we're calling tension? So I mean, tension is one thing pulling on another. So we can build that in the form of a competition between two parties, Vander versus Silco or Zahn versus Piltover, or two values, responsibility versus progress, the individual versus society, or two possibilities, will they, won't they? Will Vi win or will she lose? Which identity will Jinx pick? Or just a general question where we don't know the possibilities. What happens now? What happened to Vi post time skip? How did such a sweet little girl become this maniac? You're not just taking the audience to what happens next, you're posing questions and making them feel the question. You're using parts of the story to pull the audience along to experience the next part of the story. That's a separate framework. It's a type of big picture to construct and emphasize separate from like the actual events. Okay, now going to the second half of what he said. He used this interesting term, break an episode. This is industry lingo. Some of you lowly beginners may not be familiar with it. I know what it is because of my vast writing experience and not at all because Alex D kindly explained it to me when I asked, hey, what does that term mean on Reddit? But anyway, yes, let's read Alex's explanation. Breaking an episode, at least in as much as we've been exposed to it, is an industry term for essentially figuring out the bones of its story. In the case of Arcane/TV, this is generally something the writer's room will do together as a group. It struck me as weird initially since it feels more like you're assembling it than breaking it. We usually use it to refer to when we're rolling up our sleeves to make sure that section of story is structured well enough to move to outline script, where a writer will fill out the finer details, specifics of action, blocking, potential environment, prop details, dialogue. So Alex is describing a whole writing process here. Figure out the bones of your story first and work your way outwards. This is almost definitely worth making a whole video about at some point. But when he talks about finding the bones of a story, I think what he's saying is that it's not a process of like starting at A and then going to B and then writing C and then D until we get all the way to Z. Instead, it's like, okay, here are the 5 main things in this episode, and the process of assembling it and also what happens afterwards in the writer's room, it involves piecing together a story around those main elements. What is the best configuration of scenes that will frame that bone in all of its glory? What is the best connective tissue to get from this to that? What is the best foundation for all of it to stand on? And then only after that can you find the best in-scene details to support that. I think that's what this means. Your starting point is not the first scene of the story, the first scene of an episode. Your starting point is the bones, the main elements of the story, or the main scenes in a story, and then you're writing the story using those as a guiding principle, instead of just what comes next. As an example of what it could mean, again, this is speculation, but take episode 3, the bones might be the destruction of the sisters' relationship, the birth of Jinx, Jason Victor succeed, that's our starting point. Or if the bones are scenes themselves, we got the Vi fight scene, we got the Silco Vander scene, the monkey bomb scene, the powder Silco scene, the Hextech scene. We define those, we figure out the best configuration for them, and then we work outward and fill all of that out. Something like that, I think. And I think it's so worth framing all this as part of the discussion of mitigating soullessness, because what this is doing is really channeling everything through your most powerful scenes. The moments you're most passionate about, the moments you believe are most important, the ones that get to the deepest, most human emotions your story explores, ideally if it's good, those are the things which already have soul, which already have life. So if you can gear the more lifeless elements towards that, it's a way of kind of infusing the rest of your story with the power of those scenes. Okay, and last note on this topic, I think part of this characterization of soullessness or plot heaviness, part of that is about the story not feeling human and real like we've talked about, but I think part of it is also about the story not having identity. And aside from just the story itself, there's another aspect here that is crucial to giving a story that identity. In the AMA, a Redditor asked, how do you decide on the tone for Arcane? It has adult themes and topics, but presents them with such maturity despite being seemingly high fantasy. Was the tone decided from the beginning? Alex answered, tone was the original looming question. We decided we needed to see Vi and Jinx in their younger years as sisters in order to feel the loss and yearning as they struggle to reconnect, but this also made the show feel more kiddie. I remember calling Christian after having an epiphany that her tone could be more like that of the edgier anime I appreciated growing up. No idea why this didn't occur sooner, just hadn't felt as much like League at the time. For me, anime straddled that tonal line unlike anything else at the time, the bridge from childhood to adulthood. Once that locked into place, it got easier for me to find the story. So So find tone that will breathe life into your story. That's the lesson here. An obvious first question, what is tone? Especially if it's not story, not plot, not characters. What is it exactly? So I think tone is just an emotion, but it's an emotion you find in 4 areas. It's in the background of the story, it's between beats of the story, it's in how stuff happens, it's presented as a secondary characteristic of most or all of the main elements of a story. And for Arcane, what was the specific tone that locked everything into place? So Christian uses the word grimsicle, as in grim plus whimsical. You can find this emotional color of grim plus whimsical in the backdrop of the story overall, the setting of these twin steampunk cities. You can find it in all the little moments between beats, either in little moments here or there that are not beats themselves, or just in the ways that characters are acting. You can find it in how scenes happen, and you can definitely find it in each major element. Every character design, there's elements of grimness and of whimsy, in the aesthetics and the character traits and character backstories, and major plot points too, the monkey bombs, the tea parties, the scientific mystique, etc. And if you're thinking about the character of this tone, the edgier feel that brought it into that adolescent level of maturity, you can find that level of maturity in these 4 elements as well. The settings, the backdrop is carefully regulated to feel serious and mature, but also still free and upbeat, full of humor when it's not being serious. The subtleties between beats keep the scenes feeling that way as well, and the way things happen too, and the characteristics of major plot and character elements, it all has that edge to it while still being young. And what effect does all this have? It provides a compelling background layer of emotion that keeps the events from feeling empty. That emotion is always there to keep scenes feeling alive and human, not just dry story structure. And it also provides the sense of identity for the show, which is something that kind of brings the whole story to life independent of what's actually happening. So tone, hugely important topic, probably another topic that's worth its own video, but we'll leave it here for now. And these are all big overarching ideas about this goal of bringing life to the story, but to focus on the small picture, here's a little checklist that was mentioned in the AMA. It's a little paper they had in the writing room that spelled out criteria for a successful scene. We have how did the scene develop character, how did the scene further the plot, how does the scene teach the audience something new about the world. It's a mix of general basics and the specific ideas we just talked about, all in 3 convenient little bullet points. It's concise, it's actionable, very handy. Okay, next I want to circle back to a detail we just talked about that I think is worth isolating as its own little tip. This little sequence with Amanda once again.
That's a lovely poetic image, right? But it wasn't telling the story of the series, which is these 2 sisters being torn apart.
It's not an overly complex point about openings, but it's also just so easy to lose sight of. Use your opening as an opportunity to frame your whole story. Your first scene does, should, will communicate what this whole thing is. And that's something that you should use. You should be purposeful in that. It is really important for your audience to know what to focus on from moment 1. And that's even if you're going to surprise them with what it's actually about later on, you can still do that. But in the meantime, direct their attention. That's helpful to them. That feels good to the audience. It feels good to see, okay, the sisters. This is about the sisters. Even if you don't know this is about identity and science and monsters and bunny and whatever, you don't need to communicate a theme, just what to focus on. The sisters is what you should be focusing on. Feeling lost or feeling like a narrative is aimless for the first 50 pages of a novel or the first 20 minutes of a movie, it's just a terrible story experience you should be actively trying to avoid as a writer. At best, the audience is bored. At worst, they're frustrated. But if I have a focus, then I can feel like I'm building an understanding. I'm following something, I'm on a road going somewhere, that's great, I'm engaged. Okay, another comment with regard to plot and organizing your plot, organizing your scenes. It's really half a comment. This wasn't intended as writing advice, but when you do think of it as advice, it just speaks volumes. Someone in the AMA ended their comment by saying, also, poor powder. To which Alex responded, yes, poor powder. Imagine if things went slightly differently. So the lesson here, make things so close to working out before they fail. And this isn't just a point about how to write the climax. There's an entire writing approach that's implied here in detail. Outline your story towards a point that's not just coherent, but expected. Meanwhile, you hide another much more meaningful arc in there that's leading somewhere totally unexpected. And just when the audience is sure it's going to go one way, oh my god, it goes the other way. This is like the plot version of some of the character stuff I talked about in my moral ambiguity video, where you have 2 characters layered on top of each other, or 2 complete ways of understanding a character. There's a superficial mold that they kind of seem to fit into before we become acquainted with a much more complex understanding of who they are. Here you're writing a good, compelling plot line that's just not going to happen. And then there's another plot line out there that's really different and even more coherent and thematic or whatever, and then pick your perfect moment where it's all going to switch, and then, watch your audience's jaws drop to the floor. And a lot of the way you get to this, a lot of the way you do it, has to do with characters making imperfect decisions. This is something Christian mentions explicitly. We wanted all of our characters to be real and thus make imperfect decisions. In a logical world, in a perfect world, you have X happening 100% of the time. And that's really our 2 plot lines. We got people making perfect decisions, and then we got the little imperfections of humanity creeping in and leading to imperfect decisions, which leads to everything we fear. And that's the other way of breaking this down. One plotline is the optimistic one, the other is realistic or pessimistic. It's everything we fear. We expect the first and try not to see the second because we like to be hopeful and positive, but by the time the second one shows itself, we kind of already knew was there. So to formulate the advice, use perfect decision making to set up an optimistic plotline, and use human imperfection to lay the groundwork for your inevitable realistic plotline. Okay, now we're getting to a pretty crucial point, which is going to be the last major writing technique topic to talk about before we move on to a slightly different category of topic. And the sad thing is that most people kind of want to breeze past this part of the process, even though it seems like this is what really separates the good writers from the great writers. So at this point, you're writing all these arcs, these characters, these themes, you're incorporating all this advice, and there's a high likelihood that it's all starting to get out of control. It's become a tangled mess. You're juggling too many characters, too many subplots, too many through lines. What happened? How did it come to this? When did it all get so messy? What did I do wrong? And the brilliantly simple answer from the Arcane writers, in short, is probably nothing.
I don't know that there was any method of note-taking or documenting that ever made it easier to think about. It always just feels like this, like that ball of wires behind the computer.
It is going to be a mess 100%. And Alex's advice, or at least his knee-jerk reaction when asked how to deal with that mess, is this.
I mean, there was a certain
having
amount.
messy minds?
So messy mind, what does he mean by that? And granted, this is a throwaway answer, he talks about other stuff after this, but I still think it's a very perceptive way to talk about the topic. This is meta advice. Part of preparing for being a writer is preparing for when things go wrong. Because things going wrong isn't just something that happens sometimes, it is part of the process every time with every story in one way or another. And the way to deal with it isn't some specific tip or strategy, it's having a mind which is comfortable with this kind of messiness. Which I think both includes just like naturally your temperament, how you think, but also includes actively preparing an arsenal of strategies to deal with this mess. And that's something which is more in your control, and that's exactly what the Arcane writers did.
And then at some point, I think we just needed to become as structured as we can be,
So let's talk about that. Here's probably the most important thing from the answers that they talk about.
But I think separating especially plot and character arcs to clarify, I guess, what we're really trying to do with the characters, I think that was key.
So I'm guessing he's referencing the idea we talked about a little bit earlier, this idea over here about separating character and world plot. But I think it's interesting to take that advice, that model, and combine it with this description Alex has of how it feels to put that model into practice.
I would definitely say that one of the hardest things in my mind about building a show that vast in terms of characters is finding some way to play traffic cop with all of their stories.
So imagine this scenario. It's not just any traffic cop situation. It's like there's a tsunami and you're evacuating people. And you got to make individual decisions of who goes where at each intersection. And also the sum total of all of your traffic cop decisions needs to move the population as a whole towards a few evacuation routes in the most efficient way possible. Comparing that to the process of writing a story, you're not just managing the pace of the story on a small scale. Each unit of the small scale is also building towards bigger story goals, and you have to arrange how that happens. And the thing you're juggling is the double identity, the double function of each unit in your whole. Every beat in your story is both a character beat and a plot beat. And you're organizing that so it's all compelling moment to moment, scene to scene, small picture, and also so that it satisfies your big picture goals. You can really see how this traffic cop thing gets Arcane so many of these moments that serve so many functions at once. For example, we have a big plot goal of Jinx building a hextech weapon and using that to start a war against Piltover. So how do we get there? So place to start, our first step here, let's take a beat of Soko's choosing between Zon and My Daughter character arc. Let's combine that with a character beat of Jinx wanting to prove herself worthy of his love. Add those two together, we get a plot beat of Jinx stealing the Hex Crystal. And then now we can take that, combine that with Progress Day. That's what gets Jace involved. We can have Kate witness it, that moves her into position to meet up with Vi. And then let's also move Echo into position here right at the beginning. That'll lay the groundwork for him to get involved later on. Moving right along when Vi and Jinx meet up, we can connect that to this Hex Crystal heist thing, use that to drive a wedge between them. And once they're separated, let's call Echo back into the picture. At this point, we can give him the Hex Crystal. That's perfect. That's what we're going to use to set up this Jinx Echo fight later on. You can really feel the traffic cop nature of it. Okay, you wait here, you come forward, now it's your turn. Okay, wait a second, not you, not yet. Okay, now you go, and now you. You see what Alex meant earlier by assembling the story. Okay, next method of confronting the mess. This is a two-parter. Listen to this.
We wanted the show to have an aggressive pace. Every single show that we love definitely has those episodes where we all go, yeah, that episode kind of was a bit of a, bit of a downer or just nothing happened or so. I think we just didn't want that. We were willingly going into this thing of like, hey, let's have packed episodes and let's move things forward in the story every episode.
And here's the second part.
We, especially over time, got to grasp, like, okay, how many story beats can we have per episode? Kind of also measuring, okay, like how many scenes can we have in there, and how much can one character get? So I think usually we knew we would have about 12 to 14 kind of story beats that would fit into the length of our episode, plus minus a few, I would say.
So this is advice we've all heard before. Cut the fat. If your story is a mess, well, you can start by getting rid of a bunch of extra stuff. Fewer wires means less tangled. And what can help you with that is figure out how many wires you need. Figure out how much space you're working with. Now, granted, not everyone has a clear answer to that question. Not everyone's going to have a TV show or a movie that usually works with generally accepted size ranges, which you can then use to translate into a number of scenes, a number of beats, and or not everyone is working with an animation company that can tell you, this is our output capacity, deal with it. But that said, you can figure out how fast you want your pacing to be, and you can estimate how long you feel like your story should be. If you want a novel to feel like a Brandon Sanderson tome, or like a YA length story, if you want it to feel episodic, or if you want it to feel like one big long journey, then you can look at stories with pacing you like, and you can count the scenes and count the beats in those. Or alternatively, you can just set a size goal just out of nowhere, just something arbitrary to help you make cuts. And whatever the case, I think it will be helpful to commit to that number very seriously at first, and then ease up very seriously also later on if you need to. With the idea being that the more of these decisions you have, the more you decide to cut, it's going to give you a better idea of just what your story is. That's the untangling that we're talking about here. And once that happens, you can and should adjust your initial size range, even if that means making it longer. And either way, work with a range, not like an actual number. Even Alex here is saying 12 to 14 scenes. However you do it, as long as it's forcing you to cut your weakest scenes, it's going to be good for the story. You'll cut down on the mess and the whole picture should become clearer. Next, we got another option here, something to consider, but something that probably won't work for every story.
Something that we did kind of halfway through our season writing experiences that we started to hone in on, okay, who really owns an episode, and that character usually has a flashback in the beginning of the episode, so you really have like one character was really driving forward one episode at a time. I can't remember how exactly we came up with that, but it definitely helped with structure and committing, really saying, okay, this is going to be the episode of character X.
Find an organizing principle. A tangle of wires is all going to point in different directions. If you have most of them pointing in one direction, or you figure out a direction a lot of them are already pointing in and then point more of them in that direction, it would be a great way of just simplifying your story. One of my favorite examples of this, if anyone remembers a TV show called Skins, each series followed a group of friends, and each episode of each series used a single character's perspective. So even though we did have a pretty complex story with a lot of moving parts, the structure made it feel drastically less messy. And character episodes, by the way, are just one option. There's lots of different ways of doing this. You had like The Last of Us Season 1, which organized each episode roughly around a location and its people. We'd see like the Bill and Frank episode and their location. We got Kansas City, etc. You can do this with themes also. You can do it with colors. And side note, with any of these methods, sometimes it's not going to help you actually untangle the mess. It will just give the story a facade of things being more organized than they are. And a lot of times that's kind of enough. If the audience is getting this big loud message up front, this is the Echo episode, that itself is going to satisfy a lot of feelings that this should be organized. And the audience won't even notice that there's a ton of random like Chem Baron scenes in this episode as well. Okay, next, listen to this.
I would say that we really kind of started to understand the structure as we, approached the end of season 1 and could really track, I think, also our individual characters, where they came from, where they're headed.
On a practical level, is a fairly common piece of advice. Prioritize finishing a draft, but I like this framing of the topic in the context of mess, meaning finish the draft so you can understand what you need to cut and or reorganize. It's the end of a story that really ties everything together. And you'll often see, oh, this wire, there's no real way to tie that up, so let's get rid of it. Or this one over here, this isn't as important as I thought it was, so let's spend less time on it. Or this one, okay, this one is more important, especially if it's pushed more in this way, this one becomes one of the main wires in the middle. So the end isn't just a culmination, it's an organizing principle. It's a level of understanding you can reach and then use as a tool. Another topic that can be helpful to think about at this point, which I don't really hear people talking about as like its own thing to think about, listen to this.
I feel like we all sign up for different things based on kind of who makes the thing, right? If I watch John Wick, I just kind of want him to see be a badass, I don't go too deeply. I'm like, well, what is the essential question here and the philosophical angle? I'm like, doesn't matter. What kind of gun is he shooting? I think you kind of also need to understand a little bit like what is the quality of the story you're crafting? Where does it come from? We had the theory and hopefully now a bit of the proof that we couldn't just do another kind of fight porn project where it's just about superheroes, clubbing each other over the head in the beginning, that, a stake that we put in the ground. That we just really didn't want this to be just another, superhero thing, if you will.
figure out what type of story you want to write and what type of story you don't want to write. I love the way Christian approaches this topic, because he makes it clear that it's not just about what genre or what subject matter, so what type of relationship do I want my audience to have to my story? Like, listen to how he talks about Jace here.
Yeah, I mean, it was the best outcome, right? Afterwards, when whatever, Reddit or wherever you go, and people are like, Jace sucks, and someone else will go on, and just be like, wait a minute, like, here's what he actually did. Is that really so bad? I think that was kind of the goal.
Once we have this relationship in mind, we can ask what type of story gets me to that relationship. And that gives you a goal in the form of specific thoughts or specific feelings or mental activity. In this case, he wants his audience to ask questions. That already tells us a lot about what characters to write, what type of decisions we want them to make. And then now when we get to those crossroad moments, we have a lot more guidance in terms of how we want those decisions to turn out. And then also with this way of talking about it, you also get a model. Meaning I can't always be thinking about these big overarching functions, but if my story starts looking too much like a Marvel movie, like a John Wick movie, that's when I know to remember my goal and readjust. Helpful to have both of these aspects in mind early on, and granted, of course, it can change, but if you're starting to pick up on the general pattern here, main idea is to just have lots and lots of different kinds of organizing principles to help you be decisive without feeling confined. So next, let's talk about trust.
I would say the only other thing was to trust the audience, right? Like, I think there are a lot of places where we took risks, where the risks involved saying, I think they'll understand, or I think they'll see what we're going for here, or I think they can handle this much, right? In places where it really felt like we were going out on a limb with those types of assumptions.
This didn't immediately seem to be about the topic of messiness, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that's exactly what it's about, at least in relation to Arcane. We're talking here about trusting your audience to deal with complexity, to deal with some level of messiness. And it can't be any level of messiness. There's a point where they just won't be able to deal with it. It'll be too much, obviously. You still definitely need an underlying structure, an underlying logic to everything, but the point is that messiness itself is not a deal breaker if, and it's a big if your story is really, really good. If your story sucks, don't trust your audience to deal with complexity. Okay, last mess-related strategy we'll talk about, another two-parter. And this first part may seem pretty straightforward, but it's worth talking about just why it needs to be said. The interviewer is asking how they mapped out so many different character arcs, and here's Christian's response.
I mean, there was a certain amount of just brute force trial and error, that had to happen.
Sometimes the only way to solve a problem is trial and error. It's a very straightforward point, but I think it's worth talking about just why it needs to be said. Because the truth is that we are often looking for that secret formula. We're looking for the magic little writing tip, we're looking for the one technique we didn't know, and sometimes, yeah, you'll find something that can help you a lot, but a lot of the time, you just gotta untangle your mess by looking at each wire and trying to untie each one individually, no matter how long it takes. And that doesn't mean the story is not working. That is what working looks like. Think of Edison and the light bulb. Seems pretty inefficient to test out 6,000 different filaments, but sometimes the most efficient way of solving a problem is just to actually try every single possible solution ever. And then, yeah, you'll probably find one that works. And on a personal note, this is a psychological block that I have that's very hard for me to get past. It feels like each new thing I try that fails just digs me into an even deeper hole. The problem I'm trying to solve is getting more and more unsolvable with each failure, and that's just not true at all. With trial and error, the slate wipes clean each and every time. You can try all sorts of things to your heart's content, and it's not costing you anything but time. Okay, now part two. In the same vein, something you need while you're trialing and erroring. Listen to this, and warning once again, this could be a spoiler for Season 2 if you're not a League of Legends player, for the same reason as the last quasi-spoiler. And again, I'm going to mute the part of the clip that has a spoiler. I'm just going to put the text on screen, then I'll unmute for the non-spoilery part.
Some characters we really had to take some big risks, Excuse me. Was a character where you had to kind of capture the essence of by actually, and like these things are just scary, especially when it comes to the origin story, but to Alex's point, it's, I think respecting what's there, but also understanding that it's not our job to make exactly what people are asking for. It's our job to kind of know better what they would like.
Know better than your audience. If you are in trial and error mode and you find a solution that you believe is good, but it's a risk, you're afraid of the reaction of your audience, meaning not afraid that they won't like it, but specifically that they'll be put off because it's too different from their expectations. It's going to be jarring. It's going to make them go, wait a second, that's not right. Those are the types of insecurities you need to take with a big grain of salt. Because he's right, you do know better than your audience, and if the thing you're doing really is good, then your audience is going to go, that's not right, and then they're going to go, never mind, I get it, you were right all all along. And that's if it is really, really good. It's if it all makes sense. But once again, you're the best judge of those questions as well. Put this back in the context of solving mess. What often exacerbates the situation so much is that you have your mess and you've already deemed entire categories of solutions untenable because they're too far from audience expectations. If you get over your fear of that kind of risk, you will gain access to so many more solutions you can try out. Okay, so this discussion has steadily been moving away from talking about stories to talking about you, talking about mindset. So let's continue in that direction. Let's see what the Arcane writers have to say about decisions that come prior to writing, decisions about writing environment and good habits, and the kinds of questions and strategies they found most useful at the early stages of the process. So to start here at square one, how does a project like Arcane begin? Where do you start? What's the most important thing to think about? So listen to Alex and Christian here.
I think that was really the goal, is to find an expression of the IP that really feels like it's also made for, ourselves, if you will.
We got to spend a lot of time thinking about just, everything we'd want to see, I guess, in a show.
If anything, I think it was just a big commitment toward just following our own, what's the thing that we really want to exist. Not just saying, hey, this is something where we bend over backwards, to make something that just kind of works for everybody, but really also stay true to what, the nerd stuff that we like about this.
Write the story you would fall in love with, meaning as a viewer, reader, audience member. It's super important to realize, especially me talking as someone who makes this kind of writing advice content. To be honest here, this is a trap that I absolutely fall into in making these videos, and definitely also in consuming content like this. In storytelling, there's what you love, and there's how to effectively deliver that to your audience. And those are two independent categories. And all stuff about writing rules and tips and analysis, that's there to help you figure out the second thing. It cannot help you with the first. What you like is what you like, end of story. And videos like mine, maybe watching them can help you articulate why you love something, or they can open up a new perspective on something and you can love that new thing, but it can't establish what is a good story for you. That's something that comes from you. And as a writer, it's absolutely your most important guiding light. Because listen to this description of the alternative.
We didn't have to do this translation of saying who is a player in League of Legends? How can I reverse their psychology and then make a show that fits that? And to me, I felt that when I would watch, the video game shows or movies that didn't click for me, where I'm like, they're trying to figure me out and I can tell.
Write the kind of story you would love and you'll have a much easier job approaching your own standard than trying to approximate some other standard of someone else that you'll have to guess at. And this doesn't just apply on the macro, it also applies to types of scenes and interactions as well. Listen to Amanda here.
There's a fight scene in episode 5 of season 1, which is the episode I wrote. One of the things I'm so proud of is it's between two women with a different body type, both really muscular. They're doing moves that you haven't necessarily seen women do before on screen. 3 women in a fight scene, it's fucking dope, so.
If there's something that's meaningful to you, chances are it's meaningful to other people. And on a very similar note, when it comes to rules, this is something Alex and Christian talk about a lot across a lot of different interviews.
We were wondering okay, where are these golden formulas, that the people that work in TV have? How do you build a season? How do you make sure the characters in the plot actually stays interesting? We asked kind of everybody and their grandmother, through Riot, we had a great opportunity to talk to a lot of people, but we just had to also learn that there really isn't one great process. There really isn't the golden formula. You kind of have to find your own process.
There's a lot of good advice, but there's also a lot of rules that I think are rules because they've been rules for such a long time. So, we spent a fair amount of time just sort of figuring out which things were shortcuts that would help us to not reinvent every wheel, and which things were places where we wanted to try something different.
There's no golden formula. Do learn from others, but ultimately find your own way. This is a process that every writer should go through when they're exposed to writing advice of any kind. Doesn't matter if it's a random guy like me saying it, or a real writer, a Stephen King, a Brandon Sanderson, or even Alex and Christian, or if it's in a book, or if it's well-known writing advice. Don't try to fit the story you want to tell into rules or into advice of any kind. If it helps, do it. If it doesn't help, ignore it. You are the authority on your own story. What is going to help you and what you want to make, and what will not help you? That is the only question that matters. As we say on this channel, tools, not rules. Okay, now that said, listen to this. This is Christian talking about one of the lowest moments in the writing process of season 1.
At that point, the idea was I had to replace myself as the person in charge of figuring out the story. Of course, it was me and Alex, but I was responsible. We just knew we had to hire someone who's experienced as a showrunner and as writers and that kind of stuff.
And that's what we tried to do.
Sometimes the decision you need to make as the #1 authority on your story is that your vision is not going to come into reality with your current level of skill. And if you really care about what you're working on, you need to be humble enough to make that determination. So very simply, be ready and willing to ask for help when your story needs it. And that's not only scary because it's giving up control, it's scary because there's no guarantee. You can go through all the trouble in the world to fix your story, and who knows if it's going to work. And because of that, I love the way that Christian words this next part.
To Alex's point, like, you can't really plan magic, but you can certainly make sure that you have a bunch of magicians in the room, you know? And I think we did that.
And again, this is another call out kind of to myself and to my channel. It's kind of a call out to you too, people who watch videos like this. People who are trying to get better at writing are often trying to find the magic. They're trying to find the best advice out there, the best ideas, the best methods, and that's fine. But the other way to make magic happen is to find magicians. I'm not talking about hiring professional writers like the Arcane team did. There's something that you'll hear universally whenever you try to get good at anything. Find people who are really good at what you want to be good at and make friends with them. Ideally, find actual mentors, but if you can't, just do whatever you need to do to be around those kind of people. Because the most powerful resources to invest in are not ideas, they're people. Make use of people. Writing groups, writing Discord servers, writing friends, writing mentors. If you find yourself in a situation where you're the smallest fish in the pond, that means you're doing something right. That's exactly where you want to be. Okay, now in your search for magicians, in your search to find help for your story, you could just be looking for great writers to help you, but there's another category.
I think there were some people who just got it, you know, who understood why we want this to exist. And I think those were the folks we try to surround ourselves with.
When you're reaching out for help, prioritize people who get it. You'll come across great writers, you'll come across people who can teach you a lot about writing, people who know all the writing rules, people who've read all the books, people who've consulted for big Hollywood or whatever, and that's great, but the most important quality to look for is someone who gets it, i.e. someone who sees your vision, someone who's on the same wavelength as you about that what is a good story question as it relates to your story. If you reach out to more experienced writers, but they don't get it, or if you have a writing coach or an editor, if you're a fan of me and you have me helping you and I don't get it, I don't connect to your vision, then all the stuff I have to offer is going to be of limited use because I'll probably be trying to turn it into what I think is good. And then chances are, by the end, it's going to end up as some abomination that's a mix of both our standards that neither of us are happy with. Okay, another quality to look for when asking for help, and this equally applies to you alone as a writer, even without asking for help. Listen to this.
I think everybody on the project is out to prove something with what we're doing. And I firmly believe that you need to find someone who's kind of willing to bleed for like this thing they're trying to make. I don't think otherwise you're going to really be bold. Otherwise you're not going to really have anything where you're going to risk something. And I think you have to risk something in order to make something that makes an impact. Creative work is complex. If your expectation is that you're going to work on something creatively where you're going to have no pressure or no feeling of like being overwhelmed at times, then you're working on something the world is going to forget. I think maybe my favorite thing above all of Arcane is that I am very confident in saying that there's many people who work on Arcane right now that feel like they're working on the most important thing of their lives, like their careers. I feel like people feel like they're challenged, they're working on something that's going to matter, they're going to look back to and say, yes, like that's a proud moment of my life and I'm happy I worked on it. And that to me is probably the most important thing.
It's important for the story to be important. And if you're looking for a mentor or a coach or an advisor, it's important to be able to connect on that level. But especially if you're looking for a collaborator or an employee, then it's one of the most important things to look for. Find people who are willing to undergo pain because of how important they think this is. And as for why this is my speculation, but it seems like there are just certain aspects of the human experience that when it comes to creativity are locked behind a gate made of pain. I think that's the best way to describe it. If you want to connect with people in a deep way through your art, you're going to need to dig deep yourself, you're going to need to push yourself to places you don't normally go, you're going to need to push past a lot of protective barriers you set up around what is most important to you, because that's how you get to the most honest, real human elements of your own core human experience. And that's going to be the basis on which you can connect most deeply with your audience. Your audience is not going to be able to get to those deep levels of connection if you're not bringing them there with you yourself. It's just like a comedian. You never spend time as a comedian coming up with jokes that aren't funny to yourself. It doesn't even make sense. It's a recipe for failure. failure. If you want your stories to matter to your audience, it's got to matter to you. Now, I think there's another side of this that we need to devote some of this discussion to. To put it very plainly, it is a lot of work to make something. You need to be able to handle the extremely large amount of work that is ahead of you. And it's a topic that Alex and Christian talk about a lot. Being motivated by the importance of the work, that's a huge part of this. But even within that general reason, there are ways of relating to that importance. There's a specific nuance I want to talk about. I played part of this clip a little while ago. Let's zero in on a specific phrase here.
If anything, I think it was just a big commitment toward just what's the thing that we really want to exist.
It's a surprisingly impersonal way to talk about something you are the creative lead of. They mention it again in this exchange.
What kept you going after being told no?
I would say it always came back to, but it needs to exist. I don't really know how else to say it. It never really, I think, occurred to us to say like, oh yeah, maybe, never mind. You know, it was just like, yeah, of course this needs to happen.
This quote really brings out why it's important to have this kind of selfless attitude. If writing your story is about what you want, then that's great for today. And then tomorrow, you may not want to write your story. You need something that will drive you in a manner and in a time span consistent with the amount of work you have. Writing anything longer than a short story or novella takes a long time, and you have to keep it up every day whether you like it or not. Listen to this.
I just always had this sense of obligation to the players. You know, it just felt like we created these characters and the players answered us by spending so much time with them and loving them, and it just felt like they deserved to have better stories. We wanted to make sure the story that players got lived up to their expectations. If we couldn't do that, then we shouldn't do that.
I think that's the most useful formulation here. Be driven by a sense of obligation. Externalizing your creative endeavor as a duty, as something that's good for the world, not just good for me and for the mood I'm in today. That's going to force you to write every day. It's going to force you to do whatever this project requires of you until the work is done. And granted, you can't force yourself to feel this emotion if you just don't feel it for the story you're working on. But to share a little anecdote, I remember one time I was complaining to a non-writer friend of mine about my writer's block, and I was saying that at the stage I'm at, the problem I'm dealing with, it's just hard to stay interested in writing this part of the story. And my friend, who was a very just straightforward guy, told me, if the problem is that it's not interesting, you're the writer, so can't you just make it more interesting? It was very perceptive advice, and it's true for this too. If your story doesn't make you feel any sense of obligation towards anyone, if it's not something you think needs to exist in the world, then find something that is important, find something that does have those qualities, that does make you feel a sense of obligation, and write that instead. Okay, now what complicates this topic is that being driven like this is a lot. It's a lot of stress, it's a lot of pressure, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Listen to this.
There were definitely moments of being pretty overwhelmed for sure. I mean, speaking for myself, I'm the kind of person, I work actually well under stress, except for when you have so many stressful things that you feel like you lose oversight, if that makes sense.
So a little preemptively, let me just put the formulation here. Don't be afraid of good stress. It can be a powerful motivator. But I want to understand the distinction he's making. It sounds like he's talking about good stress versus bad stress. And when he's talking about that bad stress, he's talking about the kind of pressure that makes him lose oversight. So what does he mean by that? Oversight of what? So I think the good stress he's talking about is stress that pushes you to exert more willpower in staying on task and reaching deeper within yourself for inspiration. And the bad stress, I think intuitively we all know that kind of stress that kind of leads you to make bad decisions without even realizing it. He's describing that as feeling overwhelmed. And I think what being overwhelmed in this situation means is when there's so much pressure or so many things pressuring you that you feel like control over your life basically starts to slip. And at that point, you can try to manage those responsibilities with care and with your normal standards of quality, but so much of your energy will get caught up in just desperately trying to regain control over your life that achieving that ASAP is going to overrule all your other priorities, because that motivation, that doesn't care about quality. All it cares about is creating an experience of controlling things again. Whether that means clearing your to-do list as quickly as possible or just making a decision, not even the best one, because at this point any decision is going to feel like a good one because it's asserting control. That's my read of what he's saying. I could be wrong. So when this does happen to the Arcane team, when they are beset by this bad kind of stress, and just like a lot of the other problems we've talked about, this is not a situation of if, it's when. At the point in the process when this does happen, once again they are not too proud to ask for help, and so they bring in this very experienced TV person named Melinda, and here's what happened.
Yeah, the team health when I first started wasn't so great. Everyone was like, I was like, man, this team, they need some loving. They need some loving.
Melinda was always someone that is
extremely inspiring to the team and creating a team atmosphere where it's okay when things are tough, as long as you just kind of believe in the team and have the right dream together.
I just came in and kind of rolled up my sleeves and went from department by department, just trying to get everybody together and get to know each individual on the team as a person. And that's part of building team trust. And then you can start to actually solve the problems.
So this is just a beautiful lesson, because what the last point was saying essentially, not to get too psychological jargony, but it was saying that there's a type of good stress that assists the I, the ego, the creator me, and then there's stress that destroys the ego. And as a result, you're going to get this wounded ego that's going to push ahead of any and all other priorities in order to repair itself, because it's kind of hard to care about anything else when the self is at risk. So what Melinda did by going around and basically treating the staff like human beings was finding a way to repair the ego so that that broken self would stop frantically trying to clear to-do lists and making bold irrational decisions. She correctly understood that writers need to feel like people. They need to feel a basic level of dignity to even be in a state to make good creative decisions again. So this is the remedy, even without a Melinda to personally come and help you. Repair your ego first, and then power through. When you feel the bad stress, the destruction of ego kind of stress, even if that feeling was triggered by the work, the solution won't be found in going back to work. Address the problem directly, address the I directly, repair your sense of dignity with self-care, make yourself feel like a human being again, restore the I that you can rely on to make good creative decisions. You can do that by whatever means is best for you individually, as long as it's not the work. And then come back to the work, come back to the to-do list and the decisions with a stronger, healthier ego that can withstand this level of pressure, that can withstand this amount of work. Another element of this I want to talk about is this.
Everyone was like,
what does she mean here when she does that? So I think this is another impact of the bad kind of stress. When you feel pressure to act, to get through that to-do list, it puts you in this mentality where you approach creative problems with this very confined, rigid process. Almost feels like you're treating it like math. What makes sense here? What fits? What works? You're not thinking of what would be great, what would blow my mind, what would be exciting. You're thinking of what fixes my problem. So the implied advice here, prioritize feeling free and open when it's time to create. You need to be in a mindset where you're open to all kinds of ideas. You need to feel like you can play around, try new things, have fun, entertain yourself, thrill yourself, and finding that place of freedom requires, again, for things to feel under control enough. Your ego needs to feel unthreatened enough that it can allow you to ease it momentarily on your to-do list, and just let yourself play around and explore. I think this is why the work environments at some really creative places get kind of crazy and chaotic. You look at Pixar, for example. It's about keeping people in that free, open, playful mindset that's best for creativity. Next, here's Alex talking about this workload energy situation from a totally different angle.
I think probably the relationship with Fortiche also helped, I don't know, bring that confidence, because when you know them, right, and you understand just how much they're capable of, I don't know, it definitely fills your sails and gives you a sense that whatever it is that you come up with is going to look and feel amazing, right? That's just work that they will always do.
Like he says, this is partially about restoring confidence, which I think relates to that rebuilding dignity idea. It's about feeling like you have creative control, creative power again, but I think it's also about this. Recharge your batteries by reconnecting to the creative vision you originally fell in love with. All the stuff we talked about before about feeling like your story is important, that it needs to exist, staking your whole career on it. When your viewpoint is filled with problems and struggles and things that make you just feel sad, then that's what the whole project kind of becomes to you on an emotional level. And that's not something you feel is important. That's not something you think needs to exist. It's definitely not something you want to stake your career on. Not when it feels like that. So when you're in that mode, when your view of the project has been consumed by an obstacle like that, at that point you need to step out of the mouth of the obstacle and see the whole fish that you originally fell in love with. Metaphor got weird. And that will fill your sails again, as Alex put it. That's why I'm seeing what he's describing here. When he'd see Fortiche bringing Arcane to life, that snapped him back to the true vision he had from the start. And that is what he fell in love with. That's what originally energized him, and it's what can energize him again. Okay, now granted, not everyone has a Fortiche, unfortunately, but again, it's about reconnecting to whatever it is that originally made you fall in love. Whatever that original inspiration is, I think it will work similarly. It doesn't even have to be something that's part of your story. For me, I have this one-piece montage that's my go-to in emergencies like this. It's everything that inspired me to be a writer in the first place. I have to use it sparingly so it won't lose its power, but when I do need it, when I do use it, I come away with full sails each time. Okay, there are 3 pieces of advice about mindset, about the you, that are much broader than everything we've talked about up until now. The first one is yet another 2-parter. At one point when Alex is talking about Christian, he says this.
Christian just had a history at the company of finding ways to turn projects into a reality.
And you hear Christian talking about what that meant in detail here.
We were just kind of going, hey, let's explore it. Let's spend a little bit of money on some art. And if that doesn't suck, hey, let's see if we can create like a 3D model based on that art. If that doesn't suck, let's do a little animation testing.
And he also talks about it here in this comment in the AMA. I found myself as showrunner because I had the trust of the leadership and a clear vision that I'm usually able to make tangible for the creatives who have to execute against it. To me, that's the most important responsibility for a creative leader. Everyone has ideas, few know how to dissect it into the individual crafts and lay it out so that all the different artists, writer, voice actor, composer, visual artist, lighting artist, sound designers, etc. arrive at the same location. So if you want to write, then learn how to write. That's it. But if you want to make stuff, you gotta learn how to make stuff. If you're a writer who dreams about actually making something like Arcane, or even something smaller, a webcomic, a self-published novel, whatever it is, if that's your goal and you only learn how to write, you will still not know what you need to know to do what you want to do. And you don't need to become an artist yourself or anything, that's not what I'm saying, but learn about the processes to get stuff done. Learn about all the different crafts that go into the type of product you want to make. Learn how to plan out a project in the way Christian is describing. Get good at finding people and hiring people, and dictating things you can do to people who can. And also learn about the financial side of all this. That's probably the number one thing that stops people from actually executing on creative projects. Artists just aren't good at money stuff, so learn that stuff, become good at it, or find someone good to help you. And probably most importantly, cultivate good habits. Good work habits, good communication habits, good work ethic, good organization skills, good leadership skills. So for an overall formulation, being good at getting stuff done is a separate skill from everything creative. Treat it as such. Treat it as its own thing to get good at because you need to be good at that too. And side note, the example Christian talks about is actually a great model for what this looks like in practice. A lot of getting stuff done is about breaking things into parts, into stepping stones. A lot of it is about connecting with people who can help you. It's about knowing how to get those people on board, knowing what type of materials you need to inspire them to get on board, and then making that a priority, getting that stuff done first. Don't just try to get by on hard work and on winging it. That's a bad plan. It's probably not going to work. And on that note, within this general endeavor at getting good at whatever you need to get good at, here's what Christian thinks is the most important part of that.
It isn't the vast experience that we had that made Arcane work out. I think it was our ability to just learn really fast. Make a mistake once, learn from it really fast, and don't do it again.
Something that really annoys me in general about a lot of mindset advice is this way people almost seem to glorify failure. And I get where they're coming from, you need to fail in order to learn from it, etc. But slogans like fail as fast as you can, that is horribly worded. It makes it sound like your goal is to fail. Christian's formulation is the right formulation. Learn as fast as you can. If something doesn't work, figure out the mistake, don't do that thing again, and either try again, but this time without the mistake, or abandon the method and try a new one. So to break that down, that means learning how to identify mistakes, being humble enough to admit mistakes, and cultivating assertiveness and decisiveness and making judgment calls about when it's time to move on. And another thing the failure glorification leaves out, you should get fast at the skill of learning new things, at smoothly adopting new ways of thinking, at effectively communicating with someone who's training you in something new, get better at iterating only a few times on something new to get comfortable with it, get better at casting aside beginner feelings of awkwardness, hesitance, stubbornness. This is all stuff you can consciously work on and get better at. Okay, and this last point is a quote that itself is about something we touched on before, but there's an extrapolation I think is so important and so broad. Listen to Alex talking about pacing and not having any filler.
I've definitely had more and more the experience that Christian is describing where I'm watching something and I'm like, I understand where you're going. I see what you're trying to lay out. Let's get to the next plot point. And I think it may just be our shortening attention spans, or if you want to look at it from the plus side, our widening capability to intake information.
Did you catch the move he made there? He identified an obstacle and then immediately reframed it as opportunity. This is actually almost like a move from my own methodology video. It's an ask what, not why kind of thing. Instead of saying, why do people have such bad attention spans nowadays? Oh, it's the TikTok, it's the screens, the technology, it's all a Western consumerism. Let's just stop for a second and ask what is going on here. Let the phenomenon itself speak to you. Alex looked at the experience of people's attention spans running out in stories, and he asked, what is that experience? The form it usually takes is, I know what's happening, I know what's going to happen next. It's not people getting bored of the information and not wanting to absorb it. They're absorbing too much information too fast in relation to the pacing. And once you realize that, then, oh, that's cool. That means I can increase the pacing. That means I can fit more into my story than I originally thought. It means I can ramp up the complexity and the audience can probably keep up. So whenever you encounter an obstacle, that should ideally be your way of thinking about it. Always be looking for opportunity in whatever seems like an obstacle. Get in that habit wherever possible. I don't even necessarily know if that's the way Alex is generally thinking thinking about these things, but I expect he is. It seems so natural the way he said it. Okay, final tip. I think this is brilliant, but it didn't really fit into any category, so I figured I'd just put it here at the end. It's a specific point about improving in a specific way, and this comes from the Q&A part of an interview where the question was, how do I get better at writing voice? And here was Christian's answer.
When we create champions for our game, you basically there's 160 characters now, 160 different champions, right? And they're all supposed to be, unique. That's how they get developed. They should have their own voice. And so, but for the game, you have to write a pick me line and a ban line and a whatever laning phase lines and learning how to say the same thing in 160 different ways, because all these characters basically have to say the same thing with these different lines. Probably was a masterclass in dialogue explorations and voices, because obviously that's what it's all about, right? It's how do people say these things that are often grounded in I need to move the plot forward and I need to say a certain thing, but how do they do it individually now?
So this is just a fantastic exercise, and you don't need League champions to do this. Make up characters, find characters, use your favorite characters, and use this template to kind of just give yourself a creative workout. If this character was a League champion, what would their voice lines be? And you can take it even further if you want to. How would they act in this scene? What would they say in this scene? But I think just the basic exercise might be even better. So get better at writing character voice by using League champions and voice lines as a model. I don't have much more to add than that. Okay, so what have we learned today? What's the final word here? This is going to be the true finale. There's a lot of advice, it's a lot to take in. How can I possibly go into my next story trying to apply all these different lessons? Kind of seems daunting. So now that we've gotten to this point in the video, I want you to forget everything we've talked about and listen to this. This is one last little moment here that I think is just perfect as a takeaway. The interviewer is asking Alex and Christian about their decision to headline the show with female characters. He's asking about the cultural impact of that and where this decision came from. Was it the plan all along? Was it something you really cared about doing? Here's what they said.
I would say that the way we kind of chose the characters was very organic. We just thought they were cool.
Christian and I very much were trying to make a show that we would love, as opposed to trying to make a show that would make any kind of a statement.
One could break down all the gender stuff into these little intricate tips and steps and categories and methods. One could do that, but that is not where it's all ultimately coming from. According to the Arcane writers, you heard it yourselves, ultimately this is what it's all about. Write what you think is cool, write a story you would love, that's everything. That's all of Arcane. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. Subscribe. Happy second Arcaniversary to everyone, and happy second channel anniversary to me, to Alex, Christian, Amanda, Riot People, if you're out there. Thank you all so much on behalf of everyone here. When you were making Arcane, when you were making this masterpiece, you were probably aware that you were creating this incredible piece of art people would fall in love with. But I don't know if you realize that you were also trailblazing such a vital path for artists to follow in your footsteps and learn from you. There's going to be a generation of storytellers who will be asked about what inspired them, and their answer is going to be it all came back to Arcane. It all came back to what you gave us. So thank you. And also, please hire me. I'll do anything. I'll pour coffee for you. I'll work in the mailroom. Okay, to all the viewers, I hope this was helpful. Personally, I found this so helpful to make. I learned so much from going through all these interviews and isolating all these little pieces of advice. And also, I'll say it was an absolute nightmare to make this. It was a lot of work. But yeah, life-changing without a doubt. The impossible decision thing is probably still my favorite lesson from the whole 50. And the best part is that there's only going to be more. There's more interviews out there that I didn't even include in this. Heck, there's even so much more from these interviews I did use. And by the way, I'll link what I can in the description. But yeah, there's going to be even more interviews when Season 2 comes, and obviously more Arcane itself to learn from, so we shall reconvene next November. A couple of quick channel announcements. First, the one I'm most excited about, Studio Ghibli content is coming. That is the next little era of this channel, or at least the next few videos, and it's also coming as a result of like 10 hours of discussions with my patrons about Ghibli movies, and also a big discussion I had with Local, another YouTuber you might know, so stay tuned for that. I am incredibly excited. Second, I am looking for an editor. Email me if you're interested. Let me know about any experience you have working on other channels, anything like that. And in response, I'll send you a link with part of the audio of an Arcane video I haven't uploaded, and you can send a link of your edited version back to me. And if I like the job you did, I'll send you the full audio and we'll talk further. Kind of rough plan here is that I've been doing this for 2 years and I've learned so much, and I have not had any time to write. And that's the problem. I've only had time to make videos about writing, but I haven't actually been able to Anyway, so my goal is to have something that I can share with you guys by the time Arcane Season 2 comes out. Something like a novel, a web serial, a web comic, something like that. So I need to make myself some time to do creative stuff. And editor is hopefully going to be a big part of that, so we'll see. So I'll keep you guys updated about that. In the meantime, support the channel on Patreon if you wish. Eternal thanks to everyone there. If you're looking for a community to join of people who love Arcane and great art, both consuming and producing it, consider joining us. $2 gets you into our Discord server. And that's all I have for now. See you in the coming weeks with the new Miyazaki content. Hope you all enjoyed, and thanks for watching.